top, and so we're running a tad bit behind. But it seems popular. Had a good time. So, and I'm still eating my snow cone. Good. I pray for them too. Oh, oh, good. All right. Let's see. Where are we? All right. So, I think today we are almost finished up with where we're going to go in our church history lessons. We've got just a little bit more to go this week, and next week we'll probably do it, and then we'll have a praise night, and you guys are watching a video next week after that, because I won't be here that week, and that one's about church history. And then, and so online, that week won't be recorded because we don't have the rights to record that online. Um, then after that, we're going to be starting in on Genesis chapter 1, starting with the letter Aleph, which is the first of the Hebrew alphabet. I want to teach you guys a little Hebrew. So, so I'm looking forward to that. We do have some things we need to finish up here. We are still in the 1700s. We're going to be going ever so quickly through the 1900s. Today we're going to primarily focus in on the Roman Catholic Church, I think, for the first half, and then we'll move on to the Great Awakening in the Americans. The Roman Catholic Church, however, really suffered a great deal of loss. Remember, they were the primary possessors of power, earthly power, temporal power. Sorry, I forgot to silence my phone. They were the primary position of temporal power. So when all those revolts started happening, the Protestant Reformation happened, and when all the countries going to war, they lose a lot of their power, most of their political influence. Between 1789 and 1914, they've really lost all of this huge amount of influence. Especially when it comes to the French Revolution. Now, how many of you guys remember the French Revolution? You guys studied your history at all? What was the French Revolution? It was too long ago, I know. You're right, you weren't born then. If you were, we got some talking to do. Well, the French Revolution really was a time in which uh, the the French people turned away from the monarchy. Louis the 16th was the king of France, and they rebelled against him, and there was a great deal of uh, turmoil and triumph as they were tired of the monarchy. Um, and the Roman Catholic Church had the support of the Louis the 16th, and with the loss of, and then you have like Protestant reformations happening, and then you have things like the French Revolution happening, which so they're losing a lot of their power and their authority. And of course, then you have like the Napoleonic Wars, where Napoleon, have you remember him? Have you heard of him? Yeah, guy with his. They always have pictures of him like this with his shirt like this, and they predict him as short, but he's actually average height. And he's, you know, it's 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 these things. In I guess from the French Revolution all the way until the World War One, you really have this story of losing power. They do regain some of it, um, but there it shifts. There's becomes a major shift where they have to become. When I study the history, I see it as more of a shift back to being the church instead of being the temporal rulers. And so they lose all their power and authority, but they start recovering. I actually look at it as a good thing because they start recovering what it means to be a church again. Um, and I don't agree with a lot of what the the Catholic believe, but I do believe that it was good for them. Um, they start looking for more emotional, spiritual connections with religion instead of power, about instead of power and prestige. So it's really this time um, where they come back into power. Now the papacy was I guess it was about 1870 when the papacy started regaining ground that they had lost. We see a major shift in about 1814. We see a shift in the way they're thinking with the Papist Bill of Pius VII, which reissued the Jesuits that had been disbanded by Clement the 14th in 1773. And so in 1814 they the Jesuits. Now the Jesuits, if you don't remember, the Jesuits were the missionary branch of the church. They had been disbanded, and now they're able to start going out and witnessing again, telling people about Christ. Remember, like I said, this is really what I think. I really think about it. This is a good thing that they're as they're going through this time period. You're seeing them become more and more about the church, and less about power and emperor and so it really gets them thinking about things like education. The Oxford movement, where Oxford becomes the school to go to. Um, that greatly begins to influence and bring people back to a way where they're accepting of the Catholics, because Oxford is a Catholic church school. Um, and so and Anglican pastors start going to Oxford. Um, and you have people like um, J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and all start attending things like Oxford and the Inklings. If you do not know who the Inklings are, we're not going to get into them right now. They're really outside the purview of this class. But the Inklings, J.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and their contemporaries. Wonderful, wonderful bit of history right there. If you want to look that up, that's um, something worth reading about the group that was. Um, in fact, the Inklings were well. J.R.R. Tolkien was the guy who wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, my personal favorite author of all time. He's a Roman Catholic, and C.S. Lewis. How many of you guys know C.S. Lewis? You guys know C.S. Lewis? You read C.S. Lewis? What's one book? Who can tell me a book that C.S. Lewis wrote? What? That's right, Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. People know that one. What else? Anyone else know any of his other stuff? Mere Christianity. That's a very popular one. Screw Tape Letters. Anyone read that one? That's about the demon Screw Tape who's attacking around. It's these good. C.S. Lewis is very influential on the church. Even today, people read his stuff all the time. If you've never read C.S. Lewis, you should read C.S. Lewis. He's one of those authors that everyone should read. I recommend, for fun, The Chronicles of Narnia is a great fun time. A little more serious, Mere Christianity is a good one. My personal favorite of him is the Screw Tape Letters. But he does stuff on Reflections on the Psalms, and he's just got a ton of books. Until We Have Faces, lots of works. But he becomes a Christian because of J.R.R. Tolkien. So, part of the Oxford movement. But yeah, anyways, Pius the Ninth occupies the papal chair between 1846 and 1878. Now, he does not lose the opportunity to strengthen the Roman Catholic Church. He actually, in 1854, he's the one who comes up with the idea of Immaculate Conception. Now, how many of you have heard of Immaculate Conception? What is Immaculate Conception? Well, actually, not. No, actually, no. No, it was. Gosh, often gets confused. It's not about the virgin birth. Immaculate Conception is actually about Mary. It states that Mary was conceived without the taint of original sin, and therefore Jesus could be born without original sin. So it's actually about Mary. Immaculate Conception is about Mary, and this was something that was I personally see no biblical evidence for, but it was an idea, and it was passed into the Constitution with the idea of infallibility, the infallible Constitution of Catholic tradition. It was all faithful were to accept the dogma that of the Roman Catholics, that they must be, in order to be saved, you must accept that Mary was born without original sin. And so it's actually, and that was passed during this time period of Pius the Ninth. Because a lot of people do. When I first heard of Immaculate Conception, I was actually taught it was about Jesus being born from a virgin, and it really shocked me when I started learning that that's not what it's about. It's one of those things that we confuse. I think most Catholics, in my opinion, I was actually taught about it from a Catholic, so obviously they were confused. But yeah. So it's one of those things. I think it's just really common. That's why I brought that up. But it was during this time period we come up with that, and so the declaration that they also come up that the idea that the papal was infallible during this time period. They lost their political power, so now they're holding on to their church power and saying the Pope, not everything he says, but he'll speak in certain times, certain positions that is infallible and part of the stuff, and so it brings a lot of hostility in many countries. But a lot of it has to do with the loss of power, and they're trying to hold on to their church power, especially around the Napoleonic Wars. Like in 1870s is when the Napoleonic Wars were. That's really outside the realm of what I want to get into. Is I don't want to go through the history of France and Napoleon. If you're interested in that, there's some good books out there. Napoleonic Wars are not my favorite subject. I'm just going to throw that out there. I've tried getting into it. I have trouble with the Napoleonic Wars. There's a very famous book that takes place during that part. It's one of the classics that they say everyone should read. Can you tell me which one it is? Close. War and Peace. Right there. War and Peace. Takes place during the Napoleonic Wars. I've actually never made it through it. I read tons of books, but I've never made it through that one. That's on my list. I'm going to make it through this next time I read it. I bought a nice copy. I'm going to make it through it. Now that I'm finishing with Greek, I'm going to have time to read it. but I'll get to it. So you have that going on in England between 1789 and 1914. The mercantilism is in full force, and it's flooding the South and North America with the imperialism, and we start having those colonies start to rebel, and mercantilism starts to give way to the Industrial Revolution, which really starts to separate the churches from England, which is something that really takes important. You know, we neglect that when we separated, when we have our American Revolution, the churches also have to separate from England as well, and that's easier said than done for a lot of people. Probably more so than politically, they have to separate religiously. All right. You know what I'm going to do at this time? We're going to watch a small movie. It's about 14 minutes long. And it's about the United States, about this time period. And then we're going to come back and talk about some of the outcomes of this. And it'll cover the Second Great Awakening. Remember the First Great Awakening? What was the First Great Awakening? You guys remember that one? What was the First Great Awakening? Glad you guys are paying attention. No, the First Great Awakening was that time when they started. It did help lead to that need for revolution, but it was that the time when they started. We were talking about things like Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God. And they became very religious at this time period, the First Great Awakening, but the Second Great Awakening, I think, is actually really is more important than the First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is, we'll talk about this afterwards, but it's so important for the history of the United States and the trajectory that we're still on as the United States. A lot of it comes out of the Second Great Awakening. So let's watch this video. It's another one of those crash course. I like crash course history. It's not just about church history, but I like him. He's funny. And it's got some good some history, and it talks about the Second Great Awakening. So it talks about all that time period around it. So let's...
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we finally get to talk about sex. Also some other things. Today we're going to discuss religious and moral reform movements in 19th century America, but I promise there will be some sex. Mr. Green, is it going to be about real sex, or is it going to be about people who are obsessed with not having sex? You got me there, me from the past. But how and whether we scootily poop ends up saying a lot about America, and also people in general. So one response to the massive changes brought about by the shift to an industrialized market economy was to create utopian communities where people could separate themselves from the worst aspects of this brave new world. The most famous at the time, and arguably still, were the Shakers, who were famous for their excellent furniture, so you can't say that they really fully withdrew from the market system. Still, Shaker communities did separate themselves from the competition that characterized free markets, especially in terms of the competition for mates. They were celibate, and therefore only able to increase their numbers by recruitment, which was made a little bit difficult by celibacy. But they did do a lot of dancing to sublimate their libidinous urges. They embraced equality of the sexes, and at their peak, they had more than 6,000 members. Today, they are still one of the most successful utopian communities to have emerged in the 19th century, they have 3 members. Much more successful in the long run were the Latter-day Saints, also called Mormons, although at the time their ideas were so far out of the mainstream that they were persecuted and chased from New York all the way to Utah. In addition to the Bible, the LDS Church holds the Book of Mormon as a holy scripture, which tells of the resurrected Jesus' visits to the Americas. And while it was subject to widespread persecution and even some massacres, the LDS Church continued to grow and in fact continues to today. So while some of these communities were based in religion, others were more worldly attempts to create new models of society, like Brook Farm. Founded in 1841 by a group of transcendentalists as a dependent clause that always ends in failure, Brook Farm tried to show that manual labor and intellectual engagement could be successfully mixed. This community drew on the ideas of the French socialist Charles Fourier, who, as you may recall from Crash Course World History, believed, no joke, that socialism would eventually turn the seas into lemonade. And much like Fourier's planned communities, Brook Farm did not work out, largely because, and I can say this with some authority, writers do not enjoy farming. Nathaniel Hawthorne, for instance, complained about having to shovel horse manure, but if he'd only kept shoveling horse manure, he might not have shoveled the Blythedale romances onto an unsuspecting reading public. I'm sorry, Nathaniel Hawthorne. I do like The Scarlet Letter, but I feel like the only reason you're read is because you were like the only author in pre-Civil War America. So either we had to pretend that America began with Huck Finn's Journey on the Mississippi, or else we're stuck with you. It was just like you, Thomas Paine, Mary Rowlandson, a bunch of printed sermons, and James Fenimore Pooper. Anyway, the most utopian of the utopian communities were set up at Utopia, Ohio, and Modern Times, New York by Josiah Warren. Everything here was supposed to be totally unregulated and voluntary, including marriage, which, as you can imagine, worked out brilliantly. But without any laws to regulate behavior, Warren's communities were individualism on steroids, so they collapsed spectacularly and quickly. But these utopian communities were relatively rare. Many more 19th century Americans participated in efforts to reform society rather than just withdraw from it. And behind most of those reform movements was religion, particularly a religious revival called the Second Great Awakening. This series of revival meetings reached their height in the 1820s and 1830s with Charles Grandison Finney's giant camp meetings in New York, and in a way, the Second Great Awakening made America a religious nation. The number of Christian ministers in the United States went from 2,000 in the 1770s to 40,000 by 1845. And Western New York was the center of this revivalism. That's where Joseph Smith had his revelations. It's also where John Humphrey Noyes founded his Oneida community, in which postmenopausal women introduced teenage boys to sex, and which eventually ceased being a religious community and evolved into, wait for it, one of the world's largest silverware companies. That's right, every time you take a bite of food with Oneida cutlery, you're celebrating free love and May-December relationships. Well, more like February-December relationships. So yes, religious fervor burned so hot in upstate New York that it became known as the Burned Over District. And New York remains the heartland of conservative Christianity to this day. Or not. The Awakening stressed individual choice in salvation and a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and it was deeply influenced by the market revolution. So like while many preachers criticized the selfish individualism inherent in free market competition, there was sort of a market for new religions and preachers who would travel the country drumming up business. Awakening ministers also preached the values of sobriety, industry, and self-discipline, which had become the essence of both the market economy and the impulse for reform. There are 3 points I want to make about the religious nature of all these 19th century reform movements. First, it was overwhelmingly Protestant. Like all these new religions were Protestant denominations, which meant that they wouldn't have a lot of appeal to immigrants from Ireland and Germany who started to pour into the United States in the middle of the 19th century because A, those people were mostly Catholic, and B, reasons we'll get to momentarily. Secondly, many of these reformers believed in perfectionism, the idea that individuals and society were capable of unlimited improvement. And third, many of the reform movements were based ultimately on a different view of freedom than we might be used to. And this is really important to understand. For 19th century reformers, freedom was the opposite of being able to do whatever you wanted, which they associated with the word license. They believed that true freedom was like an internal phenomenon that came from self-discipline and the practice of self-control. Essentially, instead of being free to drink booze, you would be free from the temptation to drink booze. According to Philip Schaff, a minister who came to Pennsylvania in the 1840s, true national freedom in the American view is anything but an absence of restraint. It rests upon a moral groundwork, upon the virtue of self-possession and self-control in individual citizens. Members of the fastest growing Protestant denominations, like Methodists and Baptists, were taught that it wasn't enough to avoid sin themselves. They also needed to perfect their communities. And that leads us to America's great national nightmare: temperance. Now, you're not going to see me advocate for the prohibition of alcohol, but to be fair, Americans in the first half of the 19th century were uncommonly drunk. In fact, in 1830, per capita liquor consumption was 7 gallons per year, more than double what it is now. And that doesn't even count wine, beer, hard cider, Zima, Pruno. By the way, some people like to have home breweries or whatever, but at our office, Stan's been making Pruno under the couch. The growing feeling among reformers that we should limit or even ban alcohol appealed to those Protestant ideas of restraint and perfecting the social order. And that's also precisely why it was so controversial, especially among Catholic immigrants who, A, came largely from Germany and Ireland, two nations not known for their opposition to strong drink, and B, were Catholic. And the Catholic Church's morality didn't view alcohol or dancing as inherently sinful the way that so many Protestant denominations did. And then we have the widespread construction of asylums and other homes for outcasts. Anyone who's ever done a bit of urban exploring knows that these places were built by the hundreds in the 19th century. Jails, poorhouses, asylums for the mentally ill, and while they might not seem like places of freedom, to reformers they were. Remember, freedom was all about not having the choice to sin so you could be free of sin. Bear in mind, of course, that the crusading reformers who built these places usually chose not to live in them. And speaking of places you're forced to go, regardless of whether you want to, the mid-19th century saw the growth of compulsory state-funded education in the United States. These new schools were called common schools, and education reformers like Horace Mann hoped that they would give poor students the moral character and body of knowledge to compete with upper-class kids. And that worked out great. Just look where we are on the Equality of Opportunity Index. Now, this may seem like an obvious win for all involved, but many parents opposed common schools because they didn't want their kids getting moral instruction from the government. That said, by 1860, all northern states had established public schools, but they were far less common in the South, where the planter class was afraid of education falling into the wrong hands, like, for instance, those of poor whites, and especially slaves. Which brings us to abolition. Let's go to the thought bubble. Abolitionism was the biggest reform movement in the first half of the 19th century, probably because, sorry, alcohol and fast dancing, slavery was the worst. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the only challengers to slavery were slaves themselves, free blacks, and Quakers. But in the early 19th century, colonizationists began to gain ground. Their idea was to ship all former slaves back to Africa, and the American Colonization Society became popular and wealthy enough to establish Liberia as an independent homeland for former slaves. While the idea was impractical and racist, it appealed to politicians like Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay, and some black people who figured that America's racism would never allow them to be treated as equals did choose to emigrate to Liberia. But most free blacks opposed the idea. In fact, in 1817, 3,000 of them assembled in Philadelphia and declared that black people were entitled to the same freedom as whites. By 1830, advocates for the end of slavery became more and more radical, like William Lloyd Garrison, whose magazine The Liberator was first published in 1831. Known for being as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice, Garrison once burned the Constitution, declaring it was a pact with the devil. Radical abolitionism became a movement largely because it used the same mix of pamphleteering and charismatic speechifying that people saw in the preachers of the Second Great Awakening, which in turn brought religion and abolition together in the North, preaching a simple message: slavery was a sin. By 1843, 100,000 Northerners were aligned with the American Anti-Slavery Society. What made the radical abolitionists so radical was their inclusive vision of freedom. It wasn't just about ending slavery, but about equality, the extension of full citizens' rights to all people, regardless of race. By the way, it was abolitionists who rechristened the old State House bell in Philadelphia the Liberty Bell. Why does all this awesome stuff happen in Philadelphia? Thanks, Thought Bubble. So needless to say, not all Americans were quite so thrilled about abolitionism, which is why slavery remained unabolished. Often, resistance to abolitionism was violent. Like in 1838, a mob in Philadelphia burned down Pennsylvania Hall because people were using it to hold abolitionist meetings. And you were doing so well, Philadelphia! A year later, a mob in Alton, Illinois murdered anti-slavery editor Elijah P. Lovejoy when he was defending his printing press. This was the 5th time, by the way, that a mob had destroyed one of his newspapers. Even Congress got in on the Let's Suppress Free Speech in the Press Act by adapting the gag rule in 1836. The gag rule prohibited members of Congress from even reading aloud or discussing calls for the emancipation of slaves. Seriously. And you thought the filibuster was dysfunctional. The best known abolitionist was Frederick Douglass, a former slave whose life story was well known because he wrote the brilliant Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. But he wasn't the only former slave to write about the evils of slavery. Josiah Henderson's autobiography was probably the basis for the most famous anti-slavery novel ever, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin sold more than 1 million copies between 1851 and 1854, and despite the unreadable, heavy-handed prose drenched in sentimentality, the book is a great reminder that bad novels can also change the world, which is why it was so widely banned in the South. But while based on a black man's story, Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by a white woman, which shows us that black abolitionists were battling not just slavery, but near ubiquitous racism. Like Pat Boone re-recording Little Richard to make it safe for the white kids at the sock hop. They had to fight the pseudoscience arguing that black people were physically inferior to white people or just born to servitude, and they had to counter the common conception, still common, I'm afraid, that there was no such thing as African civilization. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I guess the author of the mystery document, I do not get shocked. Let's see what we got today. Beloved brethren, here let me tell you and believe it, that he, Lord our God, as true as he sits on his throne in heaven, and as true as our Savior died to redeem the world, will give you a Hannibal. And when the Lord shall have raised him up and given him to you for your possession, O my suffering brethren, remember the divisions and consequent sufferings of Carthage and of Haiti. But what need have I to refer to antiquity, when Haiti, the glory of the blacks and terror of tyrants, is enough to convince the most avaricious and stupid of wretches? All right, Stan, this is going to take some serious critical thinking skills, so let's break this down. So the author's clearly African-American and admirer of the Haitian Revolution, which means this was written after 1800. Plus he references Hannibal, who Crash Course world history fans will remember almost conquered the Romans using freaking elephants. And Hannibal was from Carthage, which I don't need to tell you is in Africa. He also warns that Haiti is the terror of tyrants, referencing the widespread massacring of white people after the Revolution. Okay, that's what we know. And now we shall make our guess. Henry Highland Garnett? I hate myself! It's David Walker. I'm not going to lie to you, Stan. I don't even know who that is, so I probably deserve this. That's how you learn, fellow students. It's not about positive reinforcement. It's about shocking yourself when you screw up. I got a 3 on the AP American History test, so I should know. So black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Henry Highland Garnett, and apparently David Walker were the most eloquent spokesmen for the idea of equal citizenship in the United States for black and white people. In his 1852 Independence Day address, by the way, international viewers, our Independence Day is July 4th, so he gave this speech on July 4th. Frederick Douglass said, "Would you argue with me that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him." And in the end, the sophistication and elegance of the black abolitionists' arguments became one of the strongest arguments for abolition. If black people were better off enslaved and inherently inferior, how could anyone account for a man like Frederick Douglass? Abolitionism, at least until after the Civil War, pushed all other reform movements to the edges. But I just want to note here at the end that it's no coincidence that so many abolitionist voices, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, for instance, were female. And their work toward a more just social order for others transformed the way that American women imagined themselves as well, which is what we'll be discussing next week. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. If you have questions about today's video, you can ask them in comments, where they'll be answered by our team of historians. You can also suggest captions for the Libertage. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.
Right. Well, what do you guys think of that? He crams a lot of information in those little videos, doesn't he? When we talk about the Second Great Awakening, it's a time period when there's a lot of outward people preaching in the tents, pastors sitting at camp revivals. And very much a call to the average person to come to Jesus and be responsible for their own self and and personal salvation. And but what also becomes out of it was the call to become abolition comes out of this. When you focus on the Second Great Awakening, the realization that man being saved is something that they knew for a long time, but it's becoming more and more common. Remember, some preachers even use the Bible to try to enslave and keep slaves down, but they actually forbade it from being used. because they wanted to preach. They didn't want the slaves to actually have Bibles because they might realize that the Bible actually talks against slavery. That's one thing. Even today, we read people. I hear people talk about the Bible's pro-slavery, and it's like, really, really. I mean, yes, there's slavery in the Bible. I mean, we can't deny that. Paul himself could not imagine a world where slavery was illegal. That was just something that he would not have been able to fathom. But at the same time, he's calling for slave owner and slave master to sit at the same table and be treated as equals in like the book of Corinthians. And so like the idea is so they wanted to preach, but they didn't want to actually give the Bible to slaves because they were afraid they'd realize. And as people start reading this and people start preaching, they start realizing that slavery is no longer something that they could endorse. And so it pushes the abolitionist movement forward, this desire to free the slaves, and it will lead the dates we're looking at is what we're not there yet. From the 1789 to 1914, what major event happens during that time period in the United States? Major. Really big. Everyone knows it. I heard it. That's right. Civil War. 1863, 1864, 1865. The Civil War happens during this time period. And I'm not a big fan of oversimplifying history, so I hate it when people say the Civil War was caused by slavery. No. The Civil War, the primary thing behind the Civil War was slavery, but it was not the only cause. We can't oversimplify history and just say one thing caused a war. That's not how that works. Lots of things led to it. A lot of it was North versus South. A lot of problems with rural versus urban. Farmers versus industrialism. There's a lot of things going on here that we actually had problems with the North and the South as far back before we were even a country. So it's really, but to say that it was just slavery is to dumb down history, and that's just not what it is. But it was the primary cause of it. It was a primary factor in it, though. In fact, when Abraham Lincoln was elected as president, they said, if he becomes president, then we're going to war. We're succeeding. I mean, that's because of slavery. So we can't say that it wasn't about slavery, but it was not the only reason behind it. But the Second Great Awakening, they began to preach, and they began to preach not only that slaves, that black people, white people, all were equal in God. They also started treating that men and women started realizing that they had, which will lead to the liberation, the women abolitionist movement, whatever you want to call it, leading to the women's vote. What state was the first to allow women to vote? That would be Wyoming. The idea so that actually comes out of the preaching from the Second Great Awakening, as they began to realize that, as they began to preach that about the individual coming to Christ, not just about the male, that was just the individual coming in this very passionate desires to come together. Now, that doesn't mean that all of it was good. The Great Awakening, you also have divisions among, like, the Presbyterians start to divide, and you start to have, multiple groups. You start to have, like, the Baptist split. You have, like, the Northern Baptist and the Southern Baptist, and the General Baptist, the Independent Baptist, and you start to have, the missionary but you do see people begin to go through this during this time period, as they began to work through what it means for an individual to to come to Christ and to preach. And so you have this very, unlike the first Great Awakening, where the people were like, you had, remember I talked about, what's his name? Jonathan Edwards, who was very monotone, let the Holy Spirit speak, nothing for myself, very monotone. Second Great Awakening was very fiery, very passionate, very emotion driven, very, a lot, we at our church here would feel more comfortable with it than we really would with the monotoneness of like Jonathan Edwards, because it was more along that line. They got out of order. Okay. The church itself was also facing struggles in the fact that that the country is becoming more and more urbanized. What's that mean? Urbanized. That's right. Everyone's moving to the cities. You're having more and more cities being formed, and that increased. That's because of the increase in industrialization. Remember, going through the Industrial Revolution, which means a lot of was one of the things that split the country. But you got people migrating in vast numbers, legally, and so they so you have a lot of these challenges that begin to form up, and then on top of that, you're going to start seeing things like non-denominationalism come on, and interdenominational warfare and interdenominational struggles. It's something that will begin to form. For 15 minutes. I tell you what, do you guys mind if we call it quits for tonight? Next week, I'm going to talk about foes of the faith, which we're going to talk about criticism, which I've already mentioned about in our Old Testament class, criticisms. I'm going to talk about evolution. I'm going to talk about communism. And I'm going to talk about what was the other one? Materialism. That was the other thing I was going to talk about, materialism. So we're going to talk about those things next week. If you're a praying person, and I hope you are, say a special prayer for me tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Actually, one of the reasons I'm a little distracted today, I have my final in Greek is tomorrow. It'd be nice to get my Mondays back, but I'm really nervous about this exam. I'm okay when I can look things up, but learning all the different forms and declensions has really got me struggling. Like I said, I'm good with it when I have it in front of me, but memorized, I am not there yet. I do need a 50 on the final to pass the class, so I'm praying for at least that. I am a little distracted today. I was hoping to have a little more time to study, but it's this week or on my birthday, and I decided not to do it on my birthday. During what we were scheduled for my birthday party, and my daughter's birthday party. My birthday gift is right here. But yeah. So yeah. Next week we'll talk about friends and foes, and I think we're going to call it for after we talk about that evolution and that bit. I think we're going to call it, and we'll stop talking about church history. Even though there's a lot more we could talk about. We could talk about, because we're only going to get up to the 1914. So there's a lot of stuff we could talk about, like the rise of evangelism, the rise of the evangelical movement that is now a political movement. We can talk about the all the different things that happened out of the 60s. But don't think we're going to. Somewhat, because I don't want to upset you guys when I start talking about your childhood. And but I think we're going to move into to Genesis chapter 1. We're going to start with Hebrew after our praise and worship night and that movie, and then we'll see where we go from there. Just chapter 1, 2, and 3 for sure. We'll see where we go from there. All right? Let's go ahead and close in prayer. Father God, Lord, I pray right now that you just bless us, Lord, that you just keep us in your word, Lord. We thank you for this time that we just focus in on you, Lord. I pray that thank you for this time just to tie up some loose things so we can get it as we're finishing up this lesson on church history. Help us to tie up some things and solidify our church history as we're moving into where we are now, Lord. I pray that you just help us to move forward in you as we see history, the path that has been set before us, Lord. Help us to move in according to your will and away from some of these other things that are the bad and only keep the good of history, Lord. And we praise you and we worship you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.